I'd like to welcome all of you to our conversation tonight about the new Brookings Report, A Time to Heal, A Time to Build, recommendations for the next administration on respecting religious freedom and pluralism, forging civil society partnerships, and navigating faith's role in foreign policy, written by Melissa Rogers and E.J. Dionne. Before I introduce our guests, let me deal with some housekeeping items first. This event is being recorded and it will be posted on the Berkeley Center's website shortly after the event. Second, we hope we have time for the audience to submit questions and have our panelists respond to them. So we ask you to look at that Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And by now, we assume everybody is Zoom literate, but for those of you who might not, use that tab, click on there, and please start submitting your questions as the program unfolds. And we hope to get to as many of those as we have time this evening. Let me emphasize at the top that this report is an intervention in the policy debate, not an intervention in the election. The report offers guidance for the next 4 years, no matter who takes office in 2021. References to the next administration in the report refer to whoever takes the presidential oath of office on January 20th, 2021. I'm going to start by introducing the authors of the report first, and a little later in the hour, we'll have several discussants who will be making brief remarks, and I will introduce them as they make their remarks. So now let me introduce Melissa Rogers and E.J. Dionne. Melissa Rogers is a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She previously served as special assistant to the President Barack Obama and executive director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She's also the author of Faith in Public Life, 2019. Welcome, Melissa. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Sean.
E.J. Dionne is a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center. He's also university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture, teaching in Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy and the Government Department. He is also the W. Averill Harriman Chair and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and as you all know, writes a regular column for the Washington Post. So let's begin with E.J. and Melissa. I'm wondering if each of you could talk briefly about why you wrote this report. So E.J., let's turn to you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Sean, and the Berkeley Center and our colleagues at Brookings, Darrell West, Jessica Harris, who moved mountains to produce this report on a really difficult time frame. And I'm going to get back to Jessica in a second. Bridget Brown, Chris Crawford, and the Democracy Fund, who were just awesome supporters, and Megan Bell, my assistant, who, if one can say on a religious report, went through hell to get us here, but she rose again. So I'm very grateful we're here. It's rare that designers actually tell you exactly what you've just done and why you did it. But the designers of this report pulled a quote from the report for the second page that really gets at why Melissa and I did this. On the second page, it says, we offer this report to encourage the next administration to understand how important government's relationship to both religion and civil society will be in bringing our nation together. And as we say at the beginning of the report, we've gone through a period when religion has been a particularly neuralgic and divisive force in our public life. And we wrote this report in the hope that it might again become somewhat less divisive. We have no illusions that lots of real arguments will magically disappear, but we do have hope that we might begin to focus on all of the contributions civil society groups, religious, non-religious, and secular, including explicitly secular, make to solving problems in our society. We also want to suggest that there are ways in which people, various groups, can reach out to each other. And lastly, we wanted to say plainly that how an administration organizes itself on issues related to religion can determine whether it succeeds or fails, whether it has unnecessary fights and creates unnecessary divisions, or it can move forward. the most Brookings sentence I ever wrote is in this report, and I'll claim it, so Melissa has no responsibility for it. The sentence says that bureaucracy is an unpopular word, but how organizations, whether public or private, organize their offices and their bureaus and who is there, that can determine whether issues are dealt with or brought to the forefront or buried. And we argue that a new administration must be organized and ready to deal with religious issues, because officials may not be interested in religion. Religion has a way of being interested in them and in lots of problems related to public policy.
Great. Thank you, EJ. Melissa, your views? Why did you do this?
Well, I'd certainly echo EJ's comments and his thanks to everyone, including you, Sean, and the Berkeley Center and your staff here. We really appreciate your work, and to the Democracy Fund and our friend Chris Crawford for the support of our work. You know, the relationship between religion and government is addressed by the Constitution. And so we know it's important. We know that these issues are sensitive, yet at the same time, these issues are not always given the kind of careful consideration that they require. Government can easily, and many times innocently, mangle issues in this area. And so, as the report says, we think the next administration needs to be prepared to deal with these issues from the outset, to promote the common good, honor the Constitution, and avoid unforced errors.
Great. In terms of social service partnerships, why do you think it's a good idea to go back to the structures that were in place during both the Bush and Obama administrations? And Melissa, we'll turn to you first.
Well, to be sure, the work of past administrations wasn't perfect, but I think that both administrations did recognize that government can accomplish a great deal when it listens to and works with community serving organizations, both faith-based and secular, that serve people in need. And as you all noted at the top, the next administration will confront an ongoing pandemic, racial injustice, and also a deep economic downturn, as well as a warming planet, dangerously so, as we say in the report. And it can't overcome those challenges by itself. It will need the help of civil society to do so, including faith-based and secular community serving organizations. So we think that it's absolutely critical that we return to that strong foundation. Now, of course, there were differences between the Bush and Obama administrations, and we can talk about those more later, but there was a great deal of continuity too across the two administrations in this area. So we think building on that foundation is the right thing to do. Of course, we don't want to just have the foundation and try to turn the clock back. We need to move forward too. So we say in the report there are lessons that we can learn from both the Bush and Obama administrations' work in this area. We point as well to something DJ has already emphasized, that the office should be working not only with religious organizations, but with secular organizations, including those who identify themselves as secular in their name, like secular coalitions and other groups that also serve people in need. And we also recommend, as our friend and my colleague Joshua Dubois recommended, that we look at the racial disparities that we're seeing, not only in public health, because of the way in which the COVID-19 crisis has brought this into sharp relief about how hard the virus is hitting African-American communities, but also that we look at racial disparities across a range of issues, including education and criminal justice reform, and that we make that one focusing lens of the partnership. So I think all those things are promising areas for the next administration to pursue.
Thanks, Melissa. EJ, what's your view? Why do you recommend going back to some of those structures from earlier administrations?
Well, as Melissa suggested, and by the way, I want to thank Melissa, of all people. I listed all those other people because Melissa came to me and said, this is a moment when we really need to revisit these issues again. We did a report way back in 2008 on how to reform the Bush initiative and move it forward. I think what's important to recognize is that we want to restore, but we also want to reform again and move forward. Because in the report, we quote John DiIulio, the first head of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in the Bush administration, who noted it's not 1998 or 2008 anymore. We have had a lot more division around religious issues, new controversies, but we're also dealing with a country that is even more diverse religiously than it was in 2008 when President Obama took office. Not only diverse with lots of what for Americans are new religious groups, significant populations of new religious groups, but the rise of a very large proportion of our population who think of themselves as agnostic or atheist or simply don't have any connection to organized religion, the so-called religious nuns, spelled N-O-N-E-S, not like spelled like the folks who taught me, and bless them for trying. 40% of people under 35 or 40 are religious nuns, so you have to approach these partnerships in a different way. We try to underscore, and we think that this has lessons for people both on the left and on the right, that first, we're interested in these groups not because we're interested in the providers primarily, we're interested in what all these groups do for the beneficiaries, the marginalized, the excluded, the poor, the people who need help. And that these groups are a vital part of civil society. And so a lot of times in the report, we don't even refer to faith-based partnerships. We talk about it as the partnerships initiative because we want to emphasize to everyone that you need to build and rely on civil society to solve these very, very deep problems that our country confronts. And these organizations will be vital both to pulling us together after this period of division, but also to helping our country solve a whole lot of problems.
Thank you, EJ. Let me start the third question and pitch it towards you, Melissa. In the report, you say it's often been easier for Americans to find agreement about religion's role in foreign policy than about religion's role in American public life. Why is that? And what are some of your major recommendations on these issues?
Great. Well, and I want to thank my co-author EJ as well as I start. We think that we should recognize that when we're discussing religious liberty at home, we're often arguing about things like whether school vouchers, should go to religious schools among other private schools, or perhaps a government display that includes religious elements. And those are all important issues. But when we're looking at cases abroad of deprivations of religious liberty, we're often talking about matters of life and death. There's extreme persecution going on of people of different faiths and beliefs all around the world. So even when we can't agree on some of the issues at home, we can really rally around each other and the drive to advance religious freedom for people of all faiths and none around the world and be a force for good. So we think that we can build on that very strong foundation as well. Another part of the work that Sean, you're so familiar with is helping to educate diplomats about religious facets of the landscape in which they work. We can't understand our nation or our world without understanding religion. So, we have to know when we send diplomats out in the Middle East to know the difference at basics, like what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia Muslim. So that work has also been important through the State Department and in previous administrations. But we think that an office that was dedicated to that work during the Obama administration that Secretary Kerry established and you led, Sean, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, or something similar to that name, should be reestablished to help diplomats gain religious literacy in the areas in which they work. At the same time, we think it's very important to do this robust effort on promoting religious freedom for everyone around the world as part of a larger agenda of the United States promoting human rights all over the world. And we think that these two efforts are complementary, even though they're distinct, but they're complementary. And they should be well coordinated. So we're recommending that the next administration come in with a very strong emphasis on both promoting religious freedom and this religious literacy work in foreign policy.
Thank you. EJ, your views?
Yeah, Melissa and I, as we did put this report together, and we, in fact, we had a lot of, Melissa and I have had some fascinating dialogues over 20 years of working together on this. I won't take up a lot of time because I think Melissa covered it very well. I'm grateful that David Saperstein is joining us for this conversation, because I think David, and there are people in both parties, but David really modeled how you can talk about religious freedom around the world in a way that brings in Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives, and socialists and libertarians even, because this is such a fundamental principle of human rights. And I think one of the things we do underscore in the report is that religious freedom is best defended if it is seen as intimately connected to a broad human rights agenda, that the US government should be in the business of advancing human rights. We have no illusions. We know that sometimes realpolitik gets in the way of advancing human rights. It shouldn't happen as often as it does. And I think religious liberty becomes a more consensual cause if it is defended as part of a larger effort on behalf of human rights.
Great, thank you. The next question deals with, the report notes that the debate about religious freedom at home has gotten increasingly toxic in recent years. How did we get here, and what does the report advise the next administration to do about it? Melissa, can we turn to you first?
Right. So skating over the top of this very complex question. Thank you, Sean.
I wanted you to go first, Melissa.
We've been arguing about the meaning of religious freedom at least since the country was founded, and certainly even before that. And to take us to a more recent chapter, ever since the 1960s Supreme Court decisions saying that school-sponsored prayer was unconstitutional, but students, of course, could pray on their own at school. We've been dialoguing and debating about what is called Establishment Clause issues, the clause of the Constitution that says there should be no government established religion. We had done a better job up until recently of coming together around free exercise issues, which is the other half of the First Amendment's religion clauses. But in the last few years, we've also had a serious bit of fraying on that consensus. And part of that has been due to the fact that we have been trying to build protections for people, LGBTQ people, and some who have religious opposition to same-sex marriage have asserted religious freedom protections from some non-discrimination provisions protecting LGBTQ people. So when protections have been put in place of a non-discrimination nature, those religiously opposed, again, have inserted some objections and under the banner of religious freedom. And that has created a very difficult debate and tug of war on these issues. So the next administration will confront many issues in this area, and we address some of them, as well as address the process that the next administration should use to tackle these issues. And one of the things that we say is that the Department of Justice has put out some guidance on religious liberty and has organized a religious liberty task force to deal with those issues. And we agree that it's very important that an administration have guidance on religious liberty that is coherent and consistent. And we agree with some of the guidance, but we think that the current guidance overreaches on free exercise issues and ignores many Establishment Clause issues. So we think the next administration needs to strike a better balance there. And when it does so, of course, it shouldn't make the opposite mistake. It shouldn't overreach in the name of Establishment Clause and ignore free exercise issues. So, that work has to be carefully done by people who are trained and experienced in this area. And we also recommend at the same time that a number of executive actions that have recently taken place over the past few years be immediately reviewed, because we think to some degree they reflect that fact that the balance has not been struck properly. We also say, however, that the religious liberty conversation must be broadened in some critical ways. And let me just mention one of them in the interest of time. One of them is that we must ensure that we end policies that reflect or are based in animus or bias against particular faith. And this would include the travel ban that is based on a call for banning Muslims from this country. We must never have policies in this country that are based in animus toward particular faiths or toward religion generally. And we also know that many have been targeted in recent years for hate crimes simply because of the way they practice their faith. And that is unacceptable. The next administration must ensure that everyone can practice their faith without fear. And they must restore trust between the government and religious minorities in this country.
Thank you, Melissa. EJ, your thoughts?
Well, I have for a long time thought that culture wars are just a bad idea in general, that culture wars are the wrong war. What they tend to do is take a problem, try not to solve it, and have people fight about it endlessly, usually for someone's political benefit. And I think that we've seen an awful lot of that happening around religious issues. And I say that acknowledging that some of these issues are very difficult. And I think you've had some particular controversies, which we can talk about as we go, around LGBTQ rights, including marriage equality, which Melissa and I both strongly support, and also around the issue of contraception and exactly how government should deliver that under the Affordable Care Act. We know about all of those fights. I think that what you may have, and at the risk of offending all the many good people on this call, just about everybody, is what you probably have is a tendency among some, mostly liberals, to lay heavy stress on the non-establishment side, and others, mostly conservatives, to lay heavy stress on the free exercise side. And while we do not pretend that we reach some metaphysical perfection in this report about the balance, we do think that the purpose of public policy ought to be to try to find the right balance between non-establishment and free exercise, to make sure that all of these efforts acknowledge a religiously pluralist country, and that all of these efforts acknowledge the real fears that exist on both sides. We quote Pete Wehner, who worked for President Bush, who says that often naming fears and being explicit about them can be a first step toward solving problems. And we try in the report to talk about those fears and at least try to invite people to approach these issues in ways where we might not have to be quite so fearful of each other.
That's right. And let the record show that Melissa and EJ came in on time, which is sort of a metaphysical miracle for the Berkeley events. But thank you. Before we segue to our discussants, I want to point out to our participants, if you look in the chat scroll, you'll see the link to find the report. And you're going to be told this several times today, but if you just simply look in the chat, you will see the link to where at Brookings, where you can find the report. So please make note of that, and we'll remind you that a little later on. Now we're going to pivot to a set of brief comments from our 5 discussants, and we're going to turn now to Joshua Dubois. Joshua is the former special assistant to President Barack Obama and director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships from 2009 to 2013. He's currently among many hats that he wears. He's the CEO of Values Partnership. So welcome, Joshua. It's great to have you. What are your thoughts about today's report?
Thank you, Sean and EJ and Melissa and the Berkeley Center and Brookings for convening us. Deeply appreciate the recommendations in the report, but also more generally the fact that you are telling this story. You know, we can't chart a path forward without knowing where we've been. And I think that's an important part of the report in and of itself, just sort of recounting not just the progress, but also the challenges that we all faced and what we might learn that can inform the future of this work. In terms of reactions, a few things. First, I certainly appreciate the grounding and focusing effect of the recommendation around the initiative's mission. The goal of this work is not simply resourcing for the faith community or the nonprofit sector. The goal is not just to navigate and debate issues of faith in public life, even the really important issues in all the debates that we've had. The goal of this work is to combine the force and impact of the federal government and civil society to heal people who are sick, to educate our kids, to advance development and diplomacy, as you did, Sean, to serve people in need. That might seem obvious to those on this call, but too often that gets lost in the course of the work. And it's important to say that fully and clearly, and even more important to build deliverables and evaluation, reporting, and other metrics of this work around that mission. So it's kind of the first thing. I also think it's probably no surprise that I really appreciated the recommendations around staffing. This is a broad and important sector, faith-based organizations and non-sectarian nonprofits. And the staffing of this work has to be concurrent to the importance and needs of that sector. We have a labor department that has thousands of folks focused on workforce, an education department that has similar numbers focused on the education sector. We have a couple dozen people focused on, and then that's in sort of the best case scenario, focused on supporting and amplifying faith-based and other nonprofit organizations. And so a level of proportionality in terms of the staffing of this work is hugely important. Last couple things, of course, I appreciated the emphasis on civic partnerships. A lot of our work was around pivoting to including non-financial partnerships alongside grant making and the way that the government saw its relationship with faith-based communities. But I do want to make sure that we don't lose the message around parity of opportunity when it comes to faith-based organizations receiving federal funds. Just as there is discrimination within religious communities directed towards other groups, there's also still, unfortunately, discrimination focused on religious communities. There are questions about whether and why faith-based organizations should even receive federal funding. We got those questions all the time, even those groups that are following the rules strictly. And so I think it's an important function of this office to continue to answer those questions, and just want to make sure that doesn't get lost. But listen, altogether, I think this is a hugely important contribution to the field. And no matter who is in office in a couple months, I hope that they will, as I certainly did, listen to EJ and Melissa throughout the course of their work. And so appreciate you all and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate those remarks. Now we turn to Stanley Carlson Tease, who is founder and senior director of the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance and a former staff member of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives during the presidency of George W. Bush. Welcome, Stanley. What are your thoughts about today's report?
Well, first of all, my warm thanks to Melissa and EJ for doing this and for the way you did it, consulting widely, and a great deal of wisdom in it. If I was wise enough to write the report, I'd write a few pages differently, but I hope everyone will join me in praising the breadth of it, the wisdom of it, the diversity, the respect for diverse voices that is part of it. This is a hopeful call for action. It's a call to take seriously our differences and to take seriously the negative dynamic of polarization that we're in the middle of, but then to work deliberately and creatively to find a way towards common ground. Doesn't mean we agree on everything, but to find ways to collaborate for the good of all. And that's so strong through the whole report. And I think that's a really important, hopeful call to action. You don't have to just stop with the difficulties that we see. So I want to single out 7 things for very brief comments. First of all, the report rightly says that the next administration must, from its very earliest days of planning, work diligently to understand and deal constructively with issues of religion in the public square, instead of being reactive and just wait until things come up. Secondly, as the report says, the next administration should specifically affirm a robust role for religion in the public square. Religion is so important in our country and globally, and its public role can be recognized without denigrating people and organizations that aren't religious. So I think that's really important to do that up front and specifically. Thirdly, the report's first section, as Joshua noted, a wise call to revive and improve the so-called faith-based or partnership initiative. I strongly commend the section to you. I wish I had written it. It's great. So thank you so much for that. Fourth, I commend the discussion of RFRA, religious freedom, and LGBT rights, issue of third-party harms. I would treat these important issues somewhat differently, but it's a very important and clear discussion. I think the pluralism framework is a better way to deal with these things than the discrimination framework. Just like pluralism is how we accommodate our diversity about religion and non-religion. So I think that's worth thinking about, but it's such an important thing and the issues are laid out clearly. So I commend that discussion. Fifthly, I want to commend the important recommendation, not just to staff up the faith-based offices and so on, but to recruit into the next administration church state experts in multiple crucial positions: National Security Council, Domestic Policy Council, Office of Management and Budget, and the Justice Department, right? Throughout the government, these issues come up. People who know what's happening and are versed in dealing with it are so important. So I really strongly recommend that. Sixthly, the report rightly issues a long overdue call to everyone, not just the government, to enlarge the religious liberty conversation to include communities of color with their specific experiences. I think that is so vital, and we have to find a way to make that happen and not neglect that. Seventhly, the report recommends that the federal government should find a way to build the capacity of basic civil society organizations like neighborhood groups, African-American churches. These organizations, as we see even now with COVID-19 and racial concerns, they play such an important role in their neighborhoods, but they're under-resourced and they can't easily compete for social service grants and contracts. So I think we need to find some way to resource them. My name is listed along with that recommendation, but I think the idea is a worthy one anyway. And thank you for including it. Thank you for the report.
Thank you,
Thank
Stanley.
you, Stanley. Thank you.
Appreciate those remarks. Now we turn to Maggie Siddiqui. Maggie is Director of the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Welcome, Maggie. What are your thoughts about the report?
Thanks, Sean, and thank you, Melissa and EJ, for putting together this incredible report. I want to start just by noting that you very astutely say in the introduction that, quote, issues related to religion are implicated in a wide range of policy issues. And even when public officials are not interested in religion, religion will find a way to be interested in them, end quote. And I deeply appreciate that lens and the opportunity to be a part of this discussion on how the next administration can effectively engage on those issues. So since I know my time is limited, I want to focus on specifically two issues here. One related to engagement with religious communities and one related to religious freedom. So first, again, there's so much that's important to say about the function and objectives of the agency partnership centers in particular. But as the Muslim on this call, I'll focus on one point specifically. If the administration's partnership offices are intended to offer a front door to the federal government for community organizations, faith-based and not, that may otherwise lack that opportunity, then engagement with underrepresented or minority communities should be a priority within that. And specifically, engagement with religious minority communities in the past, when it has existed, has tended to focus exclusively on civil rights and the ways that our communities are under attack, which is important. Excuse me, which is important. Yet, our communities also maintain activism grounded in our traditions on a number of issues, including racial justice, as the report notes, as well as poverty, climate change, disability justice, and more. And to the extent that the federal government deems it pertinent to engage faith communities on any public policy priority, special efforts should be made to ensure that inclusion of the diversity of religious communities in America. And the second issue I'd like to uplift regards particular challenges around religious freedom, which are discussed in the report and alluded to a couple times on this call. The current administration has introduced at least 25 regulations in the name of religious freedom that allow religious exemptions from non-discrimination protections. Now, the result of this is twofold. First, allowing for a religious accommodation to discriminate fails to recognize that non-discrimination is in the government's compelling interest. And second, allowing for the ability to discriminate in the name of religion has already allowed for discrimination against people for their religious beliefs, namely Jews, Catholics, and other religious minority groups. And so the result of these, from my perspective, is actually the restriction of our religious freedom and other rights. And the next administration must affirm non-discrimination protections and religious freedom as two inextricably important priorities. And so I greatly appreciate the attention that Melissa and EJ spent to this debate and its particular impact on LGBTQ equality. And so while I would actually differ with them on the notion that these rights require any kind of compromise, I certainly agree with their very strong emphasis on upholding both. So I won't take up more time, but thank you again for your wisdom in this report and also for the ability to join this conversation. The report is just so rich, and I think there's a lot that so many of us can affirm even across party lines. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for those important observations. Next, we turn to Rabbi David Saperstein. Rabbi Saperstein was Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom during the Obama administration. He was the former head of Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, and he was also a senior research fellow here at the Berkeley Center. Welcome, David. What are your thoughts about today's report?
Well, thank you, Sean. It's always good to be with you and with my other colleagues who are on this call. A lot to cover in 3 or 4 minutes, so let me race through it here. First, this is such a timely report. I think we all know how divisive these issues are, how complex they are, how complicated they are. That's always been the case. It was when you did this in 2008, EJ, Melissa, even more so at this point. It couldn't be more timely. Secondly, this may be the most comprehensive set of recommendations on these issues ever offered to a transition period in the early days of the next administration. Comprehensive both in terms of the amount of ground it covers, all of the issues it touched on so thoughtfully, but also in terms of the great diversity of voices consulted. I commend everyone here, when you get the report later, look at a couple of pages in the back that lists what must be over 125 different people who were consulted from across the board. And this is part of it's part of what has been involved in this work from the beginning. If you think about what John DiIulio and Stanley did in the Bush administration, there were sharp divisions over some of that work, but they always engaged with people who disagreed. They debated us publicly. They listened to us. We tried to find ways that there were common ground. In the Obama administration, it was structured through the Council on Faith-Based Partner and Neighborhood Partnerships that had broad diversity on them, coming out with recommendations, each one of the councils, the iterations of the councils, that changed policy because they were able to find and lift up common ground in these ways. Here, and I just want everyone to understand what's so vital about this. It's true with what was lifted up on the domestic side of the report in terms of these common ground consensus position papers on what the law is in schools, in prisons, in government contracting, some of which flowed out of, in the latter case, of the council's work. When you have a consensus that the government adopts, either on its own or because outside group does it, you reduce litigation, you mitigate strife. Here you lift up common ground on these issues, and it really helps address in very real terms. So it's not just the federal government. This has to do with civil society and local and state governments as well. Having good advice and guidance is crucial. And finally, on the foreign policy frontier, I just want to focus on one piece of this, and that is actually Sean's piece. of this, the RGA piece. This is so vital. Religion does play a role in almost every aspect of foreign policy for the government. Without having an office like Sean's, an independent office that has the kind of backing from the Secretary of State that Sean had, as we did here, and both Sean and I really reached out to that same diversity. The phenomenal staffs we had at the IRF office and the RGA office made a point of bringing together across religious and political lines all kinds of people. But Sean's ability to go to every aspect, economic development and conflict resolution here, and educational policy and health policy, almost every aspect of things that the government does on the foreign affairs front, have religious players who have to be engaged and have religious issues that are involved with them. So I really commend the idea of separating them again, like a Venn diagram between religion, the IRF office and RGA. They overlap somewhat, but the majority of the work is distinct and it reinforces each other. We were able to work together very closely here without being in one office. You put it in one office, one piece of it will suffer. Whatever the passion of the head of the office is, the other part is just not going to be there. And we need to expand this again. I mean, just think about this. At the height of our work there were probably more full-time equivalent staff people working on religious issues under the Obama administration than all the other democracies in the world combined. Here, it was something really extraordinary and had an enormous impact. So the next administration has an excellent opportunity to take an informed approach on these issues from the beginning, as has been said by Stanley and EJ, from the beginning, one that is coherent, consistent, and aimed at healing wounds, both within and across communities, as Zaki Barzinji said in the report. I really urge the next administration to take this report seriously, because as it says, getting these matters right from the start is indispensable to the task of healing and rebuilding our nation.
Thank you so much, David. Your check is in the mail. Appreciate those remarks.
Look, you know, Sean, what the Berkeley Center does and what Irina Fascianos does at CFR, and extraordinary work you folks do, it is a living embodiment of what RGA was all about, and bless you for carrying it on.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. Now, finally, let's turn to Dr. Sabrina Dent. Welcome, Sabrina. She is the Senior Faith Advisor at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. So, Sabrina, tell us your thoughts about the report.
Yes, I want to say thank you, first of all, for welcoming me to be a part of the conversation and to really have a seat at the table on behalf of the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum, as well as Americans United. My thoughts on the report are this. When I looked at the report, and I haven't had much time with it, I see what you've done, Melissa and EJ, is that you've written this brilliant triage document that helps address the dis-ease that is happening in our country over religion and partisan politics that have taken place that have caused harm to many marginalized communities, which include racial minorities as well as religious minorities. And I think that is important to point out because these groups are also American. One of the things that really stuck out with me as far as the report that I really appreciate is that you took much time in the first part of this report, naming the issues and trying to diagnose what some of the problems are. And that to me is important, because how can you address an issue in a country or in your life if you don't name what the problem is? And so I thought that was very important that was brought out, as well as the use of certain words. Language is very important. And language used in this report was very critical in terms of setting the context. So I looked at the words that you used. The words that stood out to me were anger, fear, deep division, polarizing. Those were just some of the words and the attributes that were used in describing like the context in the beginning. And for me, that was important because it spoke to the grief process that is happening in the country right now around these issues around religious freedom. and church state concerns. And so I really appreciated that there was emphasis placed on talking about racial injustice and disparities, as well as religious discrimination that has also led to dishumanization of certain groups. What I would have liked to have seen is more space to really talk about that in the section about religion at home. What does that look like to be what appears to be an add-on? Like you touch on it, but you don't really deep go into it as much as it could possibly be done. But I appreciate your brilliance in writing this document and offering recommendations and being clear about saying we are offering guidance. The key that people need to remember is that guidance is not always taken, but is given with the hope that there will be some type of positive change and transformation that takes place. And that's what I hope for when people read this report, and whatever administration takes on this guidance, that they think about that. But again, going back to language, I like the fact that you pointed out that the people who matter are the people who are a part of this, the great fabric of America, right? It's like you name it in terms of marginalized communities, vulnerable communities, whether it's based on who they love, how they worship, and how they navigate life. I think that was important to bring that out because a lot of people don't think about those intersections. And a lot of my colleagues on this panel have already spoken to some of the points that I want to raise. But one of the things that I really appreciate is the point about affirming a robust role of religion in the public square and help Americans better understand their rights by highlighting consensus statements. Too many times the division is often highlighted and not the consensus and where we find common ground. And I think that is essential if we want to do exactly what this report says, is to heal and to build. And so those are some of the things that like stood out to me as far as the report is concerned. And I appreciate also that you emphasized on several occasions that this is to defend the idea of pluralism, that we are a religiously diverse nation, and that it does require those that are religious and non-religious to be a part of the stakeholders and the conversation partners in doing this work. So yes, it is important to have church state experts to be engaged in the leadership aspects of it, but also in some of the decision making that takes place. And so I'm not a legal expert. I come into this conversation as a practitioner. So as a practitioner, I appreciate multiple disciplines in which this happens. And so this report actually spoke volumes to the work that we were able to do through the Religious Freedom Center and the African American Perspectives Project, because you have to name the issues, you have to talk about the history, you can't gloss over it if you want to really bring about systemic change and healing to our country. So I say bravo to you for doing this report. And as my colleague was quoted, Corey Walker was quoted in the report by saying, you know, hashtag religious freedom so white. So it's, for me, it's about expanding the table. It talked about broadening the perspectives and broadening the conversation partners, that must be intentional if true work and true transformation is supposed to happen. So with this little time that I had with the report, those are some of the things that I really value about what you brought out and the ways in which it was written in a simple way that people, everyday people, can also read it and understand it. And that, I think that is critical. So thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Really appreciate that. Now let's throw it back to EJ and Melissa. EJ, why don't we start with you? Any general reactions?
I'm not going to take a lot of time because I'd love to see if we could include at least some of the questions from the folks out there. I just want to say two things. One, thank you, every single one of you, for the most generous possible reading of this report, because I know that you could have emphasized areas that you disagreed with more, and you chose not to do that. And that is, in fact, what was so exciting about the process we went through. Bless you, David, for noting all the folks that listed in the back of the report, because the thing that struck Melissa and me as we were doing this work, having meetings with people, sending emails to people to ask their advice, is there really is a hunger among an awful lot of people across a very broad, both ideological and partisan, and also across denominations, people of all faiths and none, for a different, better conversation. There is stuff we're going to fight about. We don't have to fight about everything. And I think there is a real desire to kind of narrow the sets of issues we fight about, and have real arguments and make some decisions, but also figure out all those areas in which there is common work to be done. And again, all of you model that with your great kindness toward the report itself. So thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to echo EJ's comments here, and especially in the interest of time, but they were beautiful comments. So it's easy for me to say amen to what he said, and to thank each of you for your very astute observations, and even more importantly, for what you each do, because you each are representatives of this kind of approach in the world that works to heal and bridge divides. And I just couldn't be more grateful to each and every one of you. And I also want to say on your behalf, and on behalf of everyone in the listed in our acknowledgement sections, no, we explicitly said that we didn't ask anybody to endorse this report. There are things in here that everybody disagrees with, and they should feel free to continue to push us and disagree with us. We only listed them because they were so kind to take time to talk to us. So I just wanted to underscore that point, that they're there because they were kind enough to talk to us, not to endorse the report, but to say that they want to be part of the continuing conversation with us all.
Thank you both so much. And again, miraculously, we still have time left over for questions. So let me pivot to those, and I'm just going to exert my will here and start at the top and zigzag my way through the list of questions. Here we have a question. Thank you. If you did not address it previously, can you talk about the role of having an executive order guide the next administration's faith engagement and collaboration? President Bush and President Obama both issued executive orders. President Trump has not done so in the broad sense, while he has done so in religious freedom.
I want Melissa to take that because she took the lead on this very question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it is very important to use an executive order to articulate both the fundamental principles of an initiative and also how it will be structured in a White House and in federal agencies, because what that does is not only memorialize it in an instrument that the president signs, but it forces people to come together to flesh out what is the aim of this thing that we are doing, and who will take responsibility for it, and how will it fit into the ongoing work of government. And it also has the wonderful added benefit of sometimes making these efforts more durable, because once they're in an executive order, then it takes more work to undo them in the future than it would if there was not an executive order spelling these things out. So that is one reason why we recommended the use of executive orders by the next administration on these issues.
Just jump in there, Melissa. It's such a great point, and the operative word there is force. As you remember, we referred to that core EO. I think we actually left the National Prayer Breakfast, and either later that day or a day later came back together for the signing of the executive order at the beginning of the Obama administration, but referred to that text not just in that moment, but over and over again in terms of how the office would be structured, honestly holding others across government accountable for the particulars of the EO, and it was a critical mechanism to sort of keep things on track throughout the course of our time there. And so just want to underscore the importance of that recommendation.
And the work
Thanks
they
so
did
much.
in the executive order is really are a blueprint. So much of that can just be restored. This administration undid them, but they were really brilliant. And Melissa, you deserve so much credit for helping
Lots of
put that
credit.
together and make it happen.
Lots of credit to spread around. And by the way, I'm so glad you guys are jumping in on the questions. Please, all of the panelists, feel free to jump in on the questions. Sean, you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, this is a great question from David Hollinger. It's odd to see this affirmation of the relevance of religion to civic life when 26% of Americans now have no religion and 40% of young people have no religion. This is the time surely to press for a public sphere with less religion, not more. I worry that the report is taking exactly the wrong approach to the challenges of our time. Do I gather that the report repudiates altogether the tradition of John Rawls and Martha Minow and many other theorists that common ground in our democracy is best achieved by affirming and defending a secular public square respecting religious motivations, but refusing to recognize religious justifications? Shouldn't the report push for a strong civic we, a national solidarity with its own rules respected by all who participate in public affairs?
I want to say, if David will forgive me, God bless David Hollinger, who's done who asks, I think, a really important question that we grappled with, and who's also done some extraordinary work throughout his life on our public sphere. I guess 2 points. The report very much acknowledges at many points the very point, David, that you underscored, which is we are at a time when many more Americans are disconnected from religion, and that this is a reality that makes this different from 2008 or 2000 or other periods. What that doesn't mean, again, take the high number, take the 40% of young people, that still means 60% on the other side. It means that religious organizations are still a very important part of the fabric of social provision in our country. And so we don't think it's a denial of a civic we or a denial of the work of secular organizations to talk about the importance, the ongoing importance of religious groups. But lastly, I just want to read you, David, the last paragraph, because I think it's Hollingerian, if there is a word like that. The United States' national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, remains a sure guide for a pluralistic nation that respects both particularity and common purpose. It reminds us that the first word of our Constitution is we, and that every generation is called upon to take up the struggle to make the Constitution's we genuinely inclusive of every American. I utterly agree with that part of your question, David.
I don't want a graduate seminar on religion to pop out here, but David, I would make the observation, the statistics you quoted were not about people having no religion, but it was people who were disaffiliated formally from any religious denomination. So there could be people in that 26% figure and 40% figure who are religious in some self-expressive fashion, but who are not formally allied with any religious community. So I'm going to cut off the seminar there. David and EJ and I perhaps can debate that later. But
let's get David out to the Berkeley Center.
Yeah, we'll do that. That's a great idea. We got time for one last quick question. Thanks to all for this very thoughtful conversation. Where do Melissa and EJ see the role of religiously affiliated lobbying groups, especially those focused on a specific issue? Their efforts focus more on Congress, of course, but should they be brought into such conversations with the White House and federal agencies?
Well, Melissa's probably had more direct experience with that where she sat. We do not deal with religious lobbies as such in the report, although there's probably some implicit recognition of the fact that they exist. But Melissa, why don't you talk about, I throw all the really hard questions to Melissa. I take the fun questions.
No, not at all. So yeah, when I was on the staff and Joshua, and I'm sure Sean and David had the same experience in the administration, that we engaged with both religious and non-religious groups about issues that we were handling, whether they were partnerships to serve people in need or foreign policy matters or other matters. And so that engagement does happen on behalf of the executive branch in the White House and in the federal agencies on a regular basis. And I certainly think that should continue. Back to the previous question, I would note that it is a constitutional concept that religious people should have the same right of access to their government as non-religious people, to engage them on topics that are of interest to them. And so that's we can't get rid of that, at least we shouldn't, even if we wanted to. We shouldn't try to get rid of that because it's in the First Amendment itself that religious people have free speech and free exercise rights to engage their government in the same way that secular people do. One thing that's implicit, I think, in our report is that talking to many religious leaders, we find that there is a hunger to be involved on a deeper level in discussion with government. There's a frustration when there is a sense that religious leaders and others, this happens to others too, are just called in when the program or policy is decided and an administration asks them to promote it. There's a frustration with that approach. And instead, what people want is to be really engaged with a kind of responsive government where they give input and it is heard and processed and taken on board by government, and the relationships of integrity between people in government, all across government, and civic stakeholders, whether they're religious or non-religious. And I think every administration has to work on that and strive to do even better than the past administrations have. So I think that's certainly a goal, should be a goal of the next administration.
Well, I bear the bad news that the clock is running out. So let me begin by thanking EJ and Melissa for this wonderful report. It's called A Time to Heal, A Time to Build: Recommendations for the Next Administration on Respecting Religious Freedom and Pluralism, Forging Civil Society Partnerships, and Navigating Faith's Role in Foreign Policy. We have put the link in the chat where you can find it, and I think we'll also put that up on the Berkeley Center and circulate that when the video becomes available. I highly commend it to you. Again, there may only be 2 people on the face of the planet who agree with everything there, and we won't ask EJ and Melissa if they agree on everything, but it is a remarkable report, and we hope that it does indeed influence the next administration, regardless of what happens in a week or 2. Again, thanks to all of our viewers. Please subscribe to our event list if you'd like to stay abreast of all of our events. But again, thank you, EJ, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all of our discussants, the panel. You also asked remarkable questions and made great observations. So with that, have a great
Thank you.
night, and thank you all so much.